When you look at a traditional world map, there is this very comforting expectation of order. You have these crisp, solid borders.
Right, the countries are all neatly color-coded, blue here, yellow there.
Exactly. It implies that human beings are stationary, that we stay within our designated lines, and our cultures are completely contained within those neat little geographical boxes.
It presents a very static world, a clean, easily categorized reality where everything just has its designated place.
But then you look at actual human behavior today, and suddenly that map feels like, well, a relic. The colors are bleeding across the lines everywhere.
Yeah, we are looking at a global landscape that is incredibly kinetic. People are moving faster, in greater numbers, and in much more complex ways than ever before in human history.
Just massive.
It really is. It is the absolute definition of a geographic and cultural reshuffling on a massive scale. And the friction generated by that reshuffling is transforming societies across the globe.
Which brings us to today's mission. Welcome to another deep dive. Whether you're listening to this on your commute, prepping for a big meeting, or you're just intensely curious about the world around you, well, we see you, and this is for you.
Thanks for having me.
Today, we want to understand how we actually survive this global reshuffling. I mean, if our world is blending so rapidly, how do our brains, which are evolutionarily wired for comfortable static environments, cope with the intense friction of new culture? Okay, let's unpack this.
To do that, we are drawing from a truly comprehensive academic text. It's called Introducing Intercultural Communication: Global Cultures and Contexts, authored by Xuang Liu, Zala Volchat, and Cindy Galloy.
A really fascinating read.
It is. And to really understand the individual psychological experience of moving to a new culture, we first have to, zoom out. We have to look at the macro level.
Oh, the big picture.
Exactly. The sheer volume of global migration today is completely rewriting our historical understanding of what an immigrant actually is.
Because historically, when we thought of migration, the narrative was often focused on displaced populations, right? Or unskilled labor moving purely out of desperate economic necessity.
Or fleeing political turmoil, yeah.
Exactly. It was viewed largely as a movement of last resort.
But the source text points out how radically that historical definition has shifted. Today, we're seeing a massive wave of highly skilled migrants.
Entrepreneurs, international students.
Yes. These are people moving voluntarily. They are actively seeking higher quality of life, greater autonomy, global opportunities. It's a proactive migration rather than a reactive one.
And the numbers in the text are just staggering. According to 2013 United Nations data, there were 232 million international migrants.
Which is a huge jump.
Yeah, just to put that in perspective, that was up from 154 million in 1990. I mean, if all those people formed a single country, it would be the 5th largest nation on Earth.
Wow.
It's a demographic phenomenon that totally defies the old maps.
And they're concentrating in specific hubs, too. The USA hosts the most, with around 45.8 million migrants.
Right.
We also see that Asians and Latin Americans currently form the largest global diaspora groups living outside their home regions. And, this concentration creates massive economic engines.
Oh, absolutely. The text notes that international students alone contribute around $13.5 billion to the U.S. economy.
That's incredible.
And look at Australia. Nearly 25% of their population was born overseas. For them, international education is actually a bigger tourist draw than the Great Barrier Reef.
Wait, really? The Great Barrier Reef?
Yeah, it's a fundamental pillar of their national economy.
Which naturally transforms the cultural landscape of those host countries. I mean, you can't introduce that level of economic and demographic change without completely altering the social fabric.
It's like looking at a massive, rapidly shuffling deck of cards. Everyone, everywhere, is suddenly trying to find their new place in the deck.
That's a great way to put it.
And because people are moving at this scale, and with this level of agency, they are fundamentally changing what it means to actually leave home.
We have to look at the shape of these modern migrant communities to understand that shift. The authors introduce the concept of the diaspora.
Right, the diaspora.
The word itself comes from the Greek roots spiro, which means to sow, and dia, meaning over.
Like sowing seeds across a wide field.
Exactly. Originally, that term referred to a forced, traumatic scattering of people, but the definition has evolved.
So what does it mean now?
Today, a diaspora refers to lasting, enduring communities of often voluntary migrants who maintain an imagined community across space and time.
Imagine community, I like that.
Yeah, they don't just assimilate into their new country and disappear into the background. They actively maintain a collective identity no matter where the seeds have landed.
Which ties perfectly into the concepts of transnationalism and migrancy that the authors discuss. Because immigrants today, they don't make a sharp, clean break with their homeland.
No, not at all.
It's no longer the 19th century model where pack a bag, get on a boat, and wave goodbye to your family knowing you will likely never see them or your homeland ever again.
Right, the technology, the communication networks, the transportation systems of the modern world, they all allow migrants to build multi-stranded social networks that easily cross geographic borders.
So they stay connected.
Deeply connected, a person can be fully engaged in the political and social life of their new country while simultaneously participating in the daily life of their country of origin.
Here's where it gets really interesting. It's not about closing one door and opening another anymore. It's like living with a foot in two different rooms simultaneously. You're walking through the world with dual awareness.
The text provides a fascinating study to illustrate this exact phenomenon. Swally, in 2003, researched the daily habits of Moroccan women living in Italy.
Oh, specifically looking at their cooking practices, right?
Yes, the culinary fusion example, it completely reframes the idea of assimilation.
It really does.
Because the research observed that when these women are in Italy, they don't just cook Moroccan food, nor do they strictly adopt an Italian diet.
They mix them.
Exactly. They actively mix traditional Italian recipes with imported Moroccan ingredients. And then when they return to Morocco for holidays, they do the reverse.
No way.
Yeah, they use imported Italian goods to prepare local Moroccan meals.
It's physical, edible proof that identity isn't a zero-sum game. Being Moroccan doesn't subtract from being Italian, and vice versa. It's a fusion. They're literally blending the flavors of their two rooms to create something entirely new and transnational.
But as beautiful as living with a foot in two rooms sounds in theory, we have to look at how the new room reacts to this.
Ah, right. The reality check.
Blending flavors in a kitchen is an act of creativity. Blending cultures at a societal level generates real, measurable friction.
And this brings us to the double-edged sword of multiculturalism. On one hand, the host country reaps incredible benefits. The economic dynamism we talk about, diverse skill sets, the revitalization of aging neighborhoods through vibrant ethnic businesses.
But that rapid change also triggers profound cultural tensions. There's deep anxiety within the host country about the preservation of its own national identity.
So how do we handle that tension?
Well, the metaphors we use as a society actually dictate how we handle it. The authors contrast the traditional melting pot ideology, where everyone is expected to melt down and blend into one uniform culture, with the salad bowl, or cultural mosaic model.
Right, the salad bowl,
Yeah.
where the tomatoes and the lettuce are in the same bowl, contributing to the same meal, but they remain distinctly themselves.
Exactly. But the text introduces something called the ideological asymmetry hypothesis, which explains why not everyone loves the salad bowl approach.
Okay, break that down for me.
It essentially posits that multiculturalism appeals much more heavily to lower status minority groups. They naturally want to maintain their distinct culture and elevate their societal status.
Makes sense.
But for high-status majority groups, that exact same multiculturalism is often perceived as a direct threat to their dominance, their established way of life, and their cultural monopoly.
To understand the mechanics of that fear, we have to look at integrated threat theory, right? Developed by Walter G. Stephan.
Yes. It breaks down the vague concept of xenophobia into 4 highly specific, measurable domains of threat that host cultures experience.
Let's pull those apart, because it explains so much of the macro-level friction we see in our daily news cycles. What's the first domain?
The first domain is realistic threat. This is the fear over tangible physical things. It's the perception of direct competition for political power, economic resources, housing, or jobs.
Yeah, tangible things. What's the second?
The second domain is symbolic threat. This is much more abstract but arguably more powerful. It's the fear that the migrant group's deeply held values, morals, and beliefs will erode or completely replace the host country's traditional way of life.
It's the existential fear of losing your cultural worldview.
Exactly. Then the third domain is negative stereotypes. If the host culture already holds deeply ingrained negative expectations about how a migrant group behaves, It naturally breeds preemptive fear and hostility.
Regardless of individual actions.
Right. And the fourth domain is intergroup anxiety. This one operates on a deeply personal level during one-on-one interactions.
Like just talking to someone on the street.
Yeah. It's the individual fear of feeling embarrassed, rejected, or looking ridiculous when trying to interact with someone from a different culture simply because you don't know the unspoken social rules.
But let me push back on this framework a bit. When we look at things like realistic threat like the fear of losing a job to an immigrant, are these threats actually grounded in objective reality? Or is it more about the symbolic fear of a changing neighborhood? Because it feels like the perception of threat might be wildly disconnected from actual economic data.
That tension between perception and reality is exactly what researchers measure. The source text highlights a 2013 study by Croucher that applied integrated threat theory to Muslims living in Western Europe.
Okay.
To understand the dynamics, we have to look at the economic context surrounding cultural debates. Take, for instance, the 2004 law passed in France that banned the wearing of conspicuous religious insignia in public schools, which included the Islamic headscarf, or hijab.
A law that sparked massive debate globally about secularism versus religious freedom.
Exactly. Now, Croucher's research didn't evaluate the ethics of the law itself. They remained impartial. Rather, they used integrated threat theory to analyze the public sentiment across the UK, France, and Germany during these types of cultural clashes.
And what do they find?
The findings showed that the economic and political climate strongly dictates the level of perceived threat. In regions experiencing higher unemployment and economic stagnation, the host nationals perceived a drastically higher threat, both realistic and symbolic, from the migrant populations.
So when tangible resources feel scarce, the psychological anxiety spikes across the board.
Precisely.
The host culture becomes highly protective. They're much more likely to view the immigrant's desire to maintain their own cultural identity, like wearing a hijab, not as a personal choice, but as a deliberate refusal to integrate and a direct threat to the national fabric.
Yes. The research suggests that economic stress acts as a massive amplifier for all these perceived threats, completely distorting reality.
That macro-level societal friction creates a wall of resistance. And that wall is what the individual migrant slams into on a daily basis.
Which triggers a very specific, intense psychological cascade for the individual moving through this world.
Yes. Let's zoom in from the societal level to the deeply personal. Because moving into that wall of friction causes what we commonly call culture shock.
Right.
But the text treats culture shock as much more than just, homesickness or missing your favorite local coffee shop.
Oh, it's far more severe. Culture shock is a profound state of disorientation and anxiety. It happens when all your familiar cultural norms, the unspoken, invisible rules that govern human behavior, are suddenly rendered utterly useless.
Because we rely so heavily on those rules.
We do. The human brain relies heavily on heuristics, which are essentially mental shortcuts. Culture provides those shortcuts for, how to stand in line, how close to stand to a stranger, how to make eye contact.
And when you move to a new culture, all those shortcuts fail.
Entirely. So your brain has to manually process every single tiny interaction, figuring out how to buy a bus ticket or realizing that nodding means no instead of yes. It takes massive amounts of conscious glucose-burning energy.
That's why the symptoms of culture shock aren't just sadness. It's severe cognitive fatigue, feelings of helplessness, depression, and defensive withdrawal. You're literally exhausted by the act of existing.
Researchers mapped this psychological journey using the U-curve model. The left side of the U starts high with the honeymoon stage.
That's the fun part.
Yeah, upon arrival, everything is new, exciting, and euphoric. The differences are perceived as charming.
But then you inevitably slide down into the dark bottom of the U, the disintegration stage.
This is where the cognitive overload we just talked about hits its peak. The charm wears off, the exhaustion sets in, and you feel entirely inadequate in your new environment.
It sounds awful. How do you get out of it?
Well, the climb back up the right side of the U begins with the reorientation stage. This is the recovery phase. You start figuring out the new heuristics, finding solutions to daily problems, and regaining your footing.
And then you reach the top.
Yes. Finally, you reach the top right of the curve, adaptation. Here, you achieve biculturalism. The new culture becomes predictable, your cognitive load drops back to normal, and you can function comfortably in both rooms.
But the text outlines another curve that completely upends common sense. The W curve.
Ah, yes, the W curve.
This charts the phenomenon of reverse culture shock. Because you would logically assume that returning to your home country after years abroad would be the easy part, right? Like the ultimate relief.
It is often the exact opposite. Reverse culture shock can actually cause significantly greater psychological distress than the original move.
Like greater distress. Why?
Because when you return to your country of origin after a long period away, your brain expects all the old heuristics to work perfectly. You expect absolute familiarity.
Right.
But you discover that while you were gone, your home country changed, and much more importantly, you fundamentally changed.
Reverse culture shock sounds exactly like putting on your favorite, most comfortable old sweater, only to find out it just doesn't fit anymore, even though it's been hanging in your closet the whole time.
That's a perfect analogy.
You've outgrown it, or its shape is warped. Realizing that the place you called home no longer feels like home can be incredibly isolating.
It triggers a profound sense of loss and grief. The returning migrant might even start viewing their home country negatively, constantly comparing it to the admired aspects of the culture they just left behind. They feel like a foreigner in their own living room.
So if a migrant survives this psychological gauntlet, the steep drops of the U curves and the disorienting spikes of the W curves, they eventually have to figure out a permanent strategy for survival. How do they choose to navigate these two identities over the span of a lifetime?
This brings us to John Barry's acculturation model, which is an absolute cornerstone in intercultural communication.
Let's break that down.
Barry frames the immigrant experience around two fundamental questions the individual has to answer. Number one, is it valuable to maintain your original cultural heritage and identity?
Okay.
And number two, is it valuable to develop relationships with the new host society?
Okay, so if we plot those two questions on an X and Y axis, we get four distinct behavioral orientations. Let's go through them. If I answer yes to both, meaning I want to keep my heritage, but I also actively engage and build relationships with the new host culture. What's that called?
That is integration. You maintain your roots while actively branching out. And decades of research consistently show this is the most beneficial strategy for an immigrant's psychological well-being and long-term social success.
Got it. But what if I answer yes to the new host culture, but no to my heritage?
That is assimilation. You intentionally shed your past, abandoning your original cultural markers in order to completely blend into the mainstream society.
Conversely, if I say no to the host culture and yes to my heritage, like I refuse to engage with the new society and completely isolate myself within my own ethnic enclave, that would be separation, right?
Correct. And the final quadrant is marginalization. This occurs when the answer is no to both.
Well, that sounds rough.
It is. The individual loses their heritage culture, but also fails to connect with the new host culture. It is a state of profound alienation where you feel you belong absolutely nowhere.
But wait, there is a massive flaw in this premise that we need to address. Barry's original model assumes the migrant operates in a vacuum and has total freedom to choose their quadrant.
This raises an important question.
Right. What if the host country's attitudes refuse to let them integrate? If the host society is deeply prejudiced and actively blocks minority participation, an immigrant can't just forcefully integrate themselves. They might be shoved into separation or marginalization totally against their will.
That is a crucial observation, and it's a critique that the academic community, including Barry himself, eventually recognized. Barry later updated his theoretical model to account for the immense, often coercive power of the host country.
So it's not just up to the migrant.
Not at all. Acculturation is undeniably a two-way street. The host society has to structurally and socially allow for integration to occur. If the host culture demands strict assimilation or structurally pushes for segregation, the immigrant's choices are severely constrained by the reality of that discrimination.
So assuming the host environment is at least somewhat receptive, and we know from the research that integration is the ultimate goal for well-being, how does a person actually pull that off?
That's the practical side of it.
Yeah, if you, our listener, are moving to a new country next month, what are the specific, actionable strategies for cross-cultural adaptation?
Well, cross-cultural adaptation is formally defined as the process of increasing your level of fitness in a new cultural environment. And the text makes it clear that before you can worry about deep philosophical connections or complex identity negotiations, you have to start with the absolute basics.
Survival skills.
Practical survival skills, yeah.
To lower that cognitive overload we talked about.
Exactly. You need to learn how the local banking system works, how to navigate the public transit map, where to buy groceries, the basic daily routines. And to do that safely, Immigrants often rely heavily on ethnic social support.
Which means what exactly?
It means deliberately leaning on your own ethnic community, your diaspora, when you first arrive. They provide a vital network of practical resources, shared language, and emotional safety.
So what does this all mean? It sounds like ethnic social support acts as a cultural shock absorber. It softens the massive blows of culture shock, keeping you emotionally safe and functionally stable while you prepare to eventually merge onto the fast-moving highway of the mainstream host culture.
That is a perfect analogy for its function, a cultural shock absorber. But you can't stay on the on-ramp forever.
Right.
To fully adapt and reach the integration quadrant, you eventually have to transition toward building intercultural friendships. Engaging directly with host nationals is the only way to reduce your reliance on cultural stereotypes and build real intergroup contact.
But reaching out to strangers in a completely foreign culture is terrifying. The fear of getting it wrong is just paralyzing.
It is, which brings us to the final and perhaps most practical theory in our deep dive, anxiety uncertainty management theory, developed by William B. Gudekunst.
Anxiety and uncertainty management. Okay.
Gudekunst argues that effective communication in any intercultural encounter depends entirely on how effectively we manage two distinct internal states, uncertainty and anxiety.
Sound like the same thing.
They're related, but different. Uncertainty is cognitive. It's your brain's inability to predict how the other person is going to behave or interpret your actions.
And anxiety.
Anxiety is affective or emotional. It's the physiological fear of negative consequences, like looking foolish, offending someone, or being rejected.
Let's ground this in reality. Say you were at a foreign bank trying to open an account. The cognitive uncertainty is not knowing if you're supposed to, take a ticket, wait in a specific line, or just walk up to a desk. And the affective anxiety is your heart racing because you're terrified, everyone is staring at you and judging you for doing it wrong. If you are paralyzed by both, you freeze. You don't communicate. And if you don't communicate, you can't integrate.
The mechanism to overcome this is deliberate action. You have to actively gather information about the new culture to reduce the cognitive uncertainty.
So you observe the bank line or you ask a fellow expat how it works.
Right. By reducing the unknown variables, you dial down the cognitive uncertainty. And that cognitive clarity then acts as a release valve for the effective anxiety.
Oh, that makes so much sense.
It calms your nervous system, allowing you to take the leap, engage in the genuine interaction, and slowly build that bicultural competence.
This has been an incredibly revealing journey today. We started with the sheer unprecedented scale of global migration, the millions of people shuffling the deck, and completely redefining what it means to be a migrant.
We explored how modern diasporas are living with a foot in two rooms, synthesizing these transnational identities.
We examined the very real societal friction that causes two, the realistic and symbolic threats that host cultures perceive, and how economic scarcity acts as an amplifier for that fear.
And we traced the intense psychological gauntlet of culture shock, from the U-curve of cognitive exhaustion to the W-curve of returning to an old sweater that no longer fits.
And finally, we broke down the actual mechanics of adaptation. Using your ethnic community as a shock absorber, navigating the axes of John Barry's model to strive for integration, and consciously dismantling your own anxiety and uncertainty to build genuine intercultural connections.
It's a lot to process.
It is. But whether you are an international student navigating a new campus, a business traveler trying to close a deal overseas, or simply someone living in a rapidly diversifying city, understanding these invisible forces makes you a far more empathetic, effective communicator in our global village.
As we close out, I want to leave you with a larger implication to consider. If our world continues to shrink, and the act of living with a foot in two rooms becomes the absolute norm rather than the exception, what happens when the very concept of a single geographic home becomes completely obsolete?
That is a profound question. Because if human beings are inherently kinetic, maybe our definition of home needs to be kinetic too. Maybe the colors bleeding across the lines on the map isn't a mess of lost borders. Maybe it's the actual masterpiece. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning, keep exploring, and we will see you next time.